Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to our annual lecture series with Professor Amina Wadud today. And we have a few minutes still to begin. And at this point, I'll just give you a brief introduction about the Council for Arabic and Islamic Studies. My name is Souad Ali. I am the founding chair of the ASU Council for Arabic and Islamic Studies. I'm also Director of Arabic Studies, the Arabic Studies program, and I'm the faculty head of Classics and Middle Eastern Studies at the School of International Arabs and Cultures, the College. I'd like to ask you all please to mute yourselves, and then after Dr. Wadud gives her speech, then we can open it for questions and answers. But at this point, please mute yourselves. Thank you very much. So at this point, I just wanted to give you a brief introduction to the Council for Arabic and Islamic Studies. So reflecting on the rich diversity of both Arabic studies and Islamic studies, the interdisciplinary program of the Council integrates the study of and research in Arabic and Islamic studies in diverse regions such as the Middle East, including the Arab world, Turkey and Iran, as well as Islamic studies in regions beyond the Middle East and Africa in countries such as Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and other Muslim majority countries. The program promotes the teaching of Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, as well as other languages taught in ASU School of International Arabs and Cultures, including Indonesian, Hindi, Urdu, in collaboration with the study of sociology, history, politics, anthropology, and religion. So our mission is that the Council for Arabic and Islamic Studies was established at Arizona State University to acknowledge the significant contributions of Arabic studies and Islamic civilization and cultures to the world at large, both historically and in the modern age. The Council's research and teaching programs seek to promote multiculturalism, diversity, interfaith dialogue, cross-cultural understanding, and the expansion of human civilization and cultures through Arabic, as well as other Middle Eastern languages, as I mentioned above. My personal conviction has always been that literature is often conceived as a cultural tool towards greater human understanding. The more we study others' literary arts, cultures, and civilizations, the better enabled we become to achieve understanding and to work toward world peace, hopefully. And so at this point, as I welcome all of you and those who joined a little bit late, I'd like to welcome our keynote speaker. We are very honored today to have Professor Amina Wadud, the world-renowned scholar, and I'd like to introduce her before we begin, this lecture, very distinguished lecture. Professor Amina Wadud is a world-renowned scholar and activist with a focus on Islam, justice, gender, and sexuality. After achieving full professor, she retired from US academia, except as a visiting researcher to start King School for the Ministry in California, United States. After 15 years in retirement, she has recently... Could you please mute yourselves? Thank you so much. After 15 years in retirement, she has recently returned to academia as a visiting professor to the National Islamic University in Jakarta, Indonesia, where she's, speaking to us today from Indonesia, and we truly appreciate that it's very early morning in there. She migrated to Indonesia in 2018 to avoid the chaos of US politics and ethics firsthand, as she wrote. Author of The Quran and Woman, Rereading the Sacred from a Woman's Perspective, a classic that helped towards the development of epistemology and methodology in Islamic feminism, which is the most dynamic aspect of Islamic reform today. It is a 3 decades old and translated over 10 times, most recently into French. Her second manuscript, Inside the Gender Jihad, Women's Reform in Islam, moved the discussion further by aligning with a mandate for ethics and activism in collaboration with scholarship and spirituality. After completing a 3-year research grant investigating 500 years of Islamic classical discourse on sexual diversity and human dignity, funded by the Arcos Foundation, she is organizing an international center for queer Islamic studies and theology, the very first of its kind in the world. Professor Amina Wadud is the mother of 5 children and Nana to 6, and she is best known as the Lady Imam, as you know, the controversy when she led the prayer previously. But at this point, I'd like to just introduce her, briefly, her talk today, and then give her the floor. The title of her speech today is Half a Century of Islam and Feminism. And Dr. Wadud argues that in the past 5 decades, the face of Islam and gender has changed comprehensively across the globe. Matters concerning gender equality in Islam as practice, adjudicated and believed in, have been subject to discourse over gender. What is unique about this last half century, she said, is the rate of women and women identified participation and self-representation in these discourses. She strongly argues that the Muslim women's movement is strong, ongoing, and deeply self-introspective. It has taken authority through its knowledge, production, and paradigm shifting, radical, mostly inclusive, and intersectional scholarship and activism. Gender reform is by far the most successful of all Islamic reform movements this century. She is going to conclude with some consideration of the way forward. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Wadud. We are honored to have you, and the floor is all yours now.
A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. I'm especially grateful to my sister and colleague, Dr. Souad Ali. She has always been a tremendous colleague and support of my scholarship. And I deeply respect all the initiatives that she has also created, like Center for Arabic Studies, at ASU. If there's not a bridge, we have to build that bridge. So Dr. Souad is also a bridge maker, and I appreciate this opportunity. Before we started, she reminded me the last time that I spoke at ASU was in 2013. So it is nice to have an opportunity every decade, why not? So, I have spoken on this topic, Islam and feminism, and written about it extensively over the last decade, so much so that each time that I'm asked, I have this mixed feeling. And one is like, oh, it's just so boring. I'm just going to say the same things over and over again, inshallah, hopefully to a new audience. But the other thing that I always try to challenge myself is to find a new angle on the conversation. What I'm going to do this time, and I hope it works, is rather than to read through, a copy of another paper or encyclopedia entry or an article or a blog or whatever, I have something, for notes, but I really kind of want to talk us through, 5 or 6 main points. So I have my trusty timer. I will not go over, don't worry. But I want to focus a little bit on why I said half a century. And this is by way of my own personal location. This year, 2022, I am celebrating my 70th year on the planet Earth, my 30th year for the publication of my first book, Quran and Woman, and 50 years as a Muslim by choice. 50 years as a Muslim by choice, all of them my adult years. I became Muslim as an adult. And, you know, sometimes when you're a little kid, you think to yourself, oh, what do I want to be when I grow up, you know? And then, you know, if you think about it, at different points in your life, you revisit that question, and you revisit it by preparing yourself for where you want to go, or by looking at the things that you see are necessary and beautiful in the world that you can contribute. And so you develop your capacity to do that. In my case, I just want to say how I've used this year, actually I started, you know, last year because that's the nature of the beast, but I've used this year to reflect on what it was like as a 20-year-old to walk into the door of Islam. And, you know, I never even intended to take the Shahada. I went to a mosque because I had been reading about Islam and I had been interested. And the men that were there, because I was also covering, maybe not in this particular form or fashion, but you know, I was looking more modest. It would have been part of my own growth as a Black woman in America, particularly to dress more modestly in the public spaces. And they were like, oh, if you believe there's no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet, you should just take Shahada. It was Thanksgiving Day, 1972. And, you know, even though I took the Shahada, I didn't make a lifetime dedication at that time. What happened instead is that about 4 or 5 months later, someone gifted me a copy of the Quran. Now, in my estimation, this should have come with the Shahada, especially if you don't know, right? But I had gone to my university library, I was undergraduate, and started reading books about Islam, anything, you know, I had no direction, you know, but I did have a good library resource. And I had not been pointed to the Quran. I mean, Allah is merciful, actually, because literally, once I started reading the Quran in English only, and today it's by a translator whose work I cannot abide by. It's just too sexist, too racist, too homophobic, you know. Nevertheless, I fell in love. I fell in love with the Quran, and it was at that time that I truly began to deepen my entry into Islam from the level of the heart and the mind in combination. And then I dedicated the rest of my life not only to the study of the Quran, but to the participation in what we call the production of knowledge in Islam, which I will come back to, through understanding that text as the central gift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave to the Prophet, upon him be peace, to direct and guide all of humanity, all of us on the planet. This was such a beautiful gift. And not only was it a beautiful gift for all humanity, it was a gift that Allah gave to me personally that sparked a love that now 50 years later is still going strong. And I think that that's a gift that not a lot of people can say, that you look back on your life 50 years, and in that, I mean, I'm 70, but I'm only looking at the 50 years of Islam. And in that time, you are still in love, you're still motivated, I'm still learning from the Quran, I'm still exchanging possibilities of meaning. You know, I couldn't have scripted a better life for me than, you know, that sort of, you know, that accidental tourist title, sort of the accidental Muslim, because on that day in Thanksgiving, I did not look out at 50 years ahead of me, but now I'm looking back at 50 years ahead of me. And for our particular topic, because I know you're not interested in hearing about me and all my love and everything, for our particular topic on Islam and feminism, I decided to locate my comments within the rubric of literally a half a century. What has happened in that half a century, I have been witness to and a participant in certain ways within, and also been challenged by and had to, as I said, help with the production of new knowledge surrounding. Now, in order to understand where I'm going to go with this, you need to understand that there is an epistemology at stake here. And that epistemology has been central to the transformative development that I will be talking about. Two key words, obviously there's only the word "and" in between, Islam and feminism. We're going to have to unpack those words because they are not static. They are not stagnant. They have evolved, they've been challenged. I want to start with Islam because just like other keywords that have something to do with history, metaphysics, politics, art, spirituality, and the like, social justice, for example, no one uses the word exactly the same way as their neighbor. I think about that book, Shadab's book on, what is Islam? It's like 600 pages, 600 pages. So that book itself demonstrates that it is not a one-time conversation. And when you have that conversation, then everything is clear and agreed upon by everyone. And in our time, within the last, decade and a half, the entry of Daesh, or the so-called Islamic State violent, intrusion into the lives of other Muslims as well as non-Muslims, have alerted us to the fact that just because someone uses the word Islam does not mean that they're using it in exactly the same way. So we have to, as I said, we have to unpack it. In my case, I am particularly interested, obviously, in spirituality, but I'm also interested in Islam as a system that is built upon the primary sources of the text, the Quran, the Revelation, and the prophetic traditions. And by prophetic traditions, I mean not only his statements, but his behavior, and what we call the Sunnah, as well as what has developed from these two primary sources by way of ethics, philosophy, mysticism, art, politics, economics, spirituality, and the like. And these disciplines are secondary sources to what we call Islam, and they are all 100% constructed by human beings. There's a beauty in this, but there's also a challenge. And one of the challenges is that around about the time of the Abbasid dynasty, the tremendous strides in the rights of women that were laid down by the prophetic Sunnah and practice, and also by the Quran, had begun to recede, and the legacy that was bequeathed to us in the future of Islam was primarily written by men, from men's perspective, from their scholarship, from their spirituality. It's not like I'm trying to say that this is a negative, but there is a consequence of presuming only the male subject as the center of the construction of Islam, and that is that it sometimes excludes us, women. Not only does it exclude us, but also it shapes what is our role in accordance to what is seen as primary from the perspective of men's experiences with Islam, with Allah, through the Prophet ﷺ, in their construction of Islam. And so we become not only secondary, but we sometimes become a utility for men's striving to achieve the excellence of their Islam. And yet, those primary sources confirmed that we were free and equal from the moment that we were a thought in the mind of our creator, Allah. We and men were equally a part of the design. In Nija'ilun Firaj Khalifa came to us وَخَلَقْنَاكُم مِّن ذَكَرٍ وَأُنثَى. It came to us with an affirmation that مِن كُلِّ شَيْءٍ خَلَقْنَا زَوْجَيْنِ. We have created this two pair. In other words, there is a dynamic and necessary relationship between male and female, and it is reflected in the terms masculine and feminine, which I hope I will have a chance to get to, because I am not simply talking about women as some kind of heteronormative exclusive binary. But the idea of the sacred relationship between masculine and feminine, al-jalal wal-jamal, got lost when this predilection towards men, men's ways of being, men's ways of knowing, men's ways of striving towards Allah became central, which of course it should for men, but it should not for both men and women equally unless it is in fact truly universal. So instead, what we lost beginning around the Abbasid period was the dynamic interplay between women and men as partners in the journey towards Allah. The vehicle of this loss we now identify as patriarchy. Now, patriarchy is not limited to Islam. It's not Islamic in origin. It existed before Islam. It still exists, although hopefully we will see the end of it very soon. But the understanding of it is that it privileges men in the context of our discourse over humanity. And this privileging fell through a kind of Hellenistic construct that whenever two come together, one of them has to be above the other. And this led to a distinction in the Hellenistic period. It was a distinction between citizen and non-citizen. In Islam, it was a distinction between Muslim and non-Muslim, but also a distinction between male and female, and a distinction between free and slave. So in fact, patriarchy is the origins of an institution that we now know is abhorrent, and that is slavery. Slavery allows for two human beings to come together and one of them to be in service to the other, and that other, it becomes master. A construct of justice that relies upon these unequal locations was one where justice could only be achieved if each were given their due in their location. In the 20th century, we came to understand that no, you can't put any human, any genre of human beings, any subcategory of human beings, any race, gender, religion, language group, ethnicity, geographical location. You cannot put another human being in a position below a human being and still call that justice. And that was the origins of the modern human rights debate. And for me, that was also the origins of what I now call the Tawhidic paradigm. The Tawhidic paradigm is built upon the fundamental understanding of Tawhid, which is indispensable with Islam. It expresses not only that Allah is one, but also that Allah is the force, not the force, it's sort of the energy that creates horizontal reciprocity between all beings, because only Allah can be above. All of us then come to each other only on a horizontal line of reciprocity if we believe in that sacred divine being as being ultimate, subhanahu, supreme and all powerful, all seeing, all knowing, all loving. If we believe in that one being, then as a consequence, the rest of us can only meet on the line of horizontal reciprocity. And that's called Musawa. And I coined an understanding of the Tawhidic paradigm while working on issues of gender and social justice. And I use it in concert with women and men who are working to affirm the basic human equality of all people, and particularly in the context of the development of all forms of Islamic law which today is pretty much limited to the practice of personal status law. Let me say a little bit about this personal status law, especially as it relates to gender. In the beginning, it was clear from really the very first movement of the Prophet in society that Islam was a way of life. And establishing that way of life, you could say, became a prophetic mission. And he had to establish it in his context, in his time, and in accordance to the strengths and the necessities and the challenges of his time, with which I personally think he did a pretty good job. So that's not even the question. The question was, when the Prophet ﷺ returns to Allah, and that legacy is left with us humans, from the companions to the next generation, et cetera, how do we then sustain this living system? And that became the subject of discourse and debate for the next hundreds of years. And from it, as we know, grew the major schools of Islamic law, the madhahib. And yet, the fact that there even today still exist 4 major Sunni orientations and at least 1 or 2 major Shia orientations lets you know that there was always a diversity, and that diversity was part of the dynamism of the system. And the goal of that dynamic intellectual and political and, in fact, spiritual exchange was, again, how do we live Islam? Now, there's some aspects about how we live Islam if you're a woman, especially if you're a reproducing woman, right? There's some aspects about that experience which could not be categorized as easily by simply referring to the prophetic sunnah. The Prophet never had menstruation, he never delivered a baby through his body, he never nursed a child, and all of these things are important. And how those things come about, that is the whole nature of reproduction, the nature of intimate relationships between women and men, all of that is also encoded in the law. And yet, for the most part, the representation of women in how we understand those things, in my estimation, was never quite as affirmed as the representation of men for their own understanding of it. Case in point, most schools of law respond to the offense of rape by saying justice will be served when the rapist marries the rape victim. Who could think something like that except for somebody who is not themselves the one who is being raped? There's a reduction of woman to her reproductive organs that does not consider that there's more to us than that. That we know for sure if we are reading through the Quran and looking at the legacy of the Prophet. But there's a logic that's given there, and that logic is the reduction of women's reproductive capacity as something extremely valuable, something that should be protected. And there's so many ways in which that's encoded in the law. But the conclusion that that is the just solution is just a sort of, it's a sort of gross example about how it is necessary for women to represent themselves in the way in which justice is conceived and justice is in fact experienced. And this is the kind of work that was done that leads me to accept, which has only been, let's see, this is 1922, it's been 13 years, to accept the term feminism. So let's look a little bit at feminism, and then I want to once again look at how the two things work together. Feminism is also not static. Of course, there were universal, or let's just say regional movements where women asserted their understanding of their own being. How much legacy this would get at the public realm has fluctuated, throughout history. And from these self-assertions and self-identifications and self-representations came a movement. And this movement has not been uniform. It has not been monolithic, but rather it has ebbed and flowed with the mandates provided by the context of time and place. So before there was Islamic feminism, there were Muslims who were feminist, and they pretty much borrowed from the feminist models that were given by other cultures, because the goal of making an affirmation of women's ways of knowing, women's ways of being, women's ways of experiencing life, women's ways of producing knowledge, women's subjectivities in epistemologies, women's roles in society and culture. Muslim women were not the first ones to do this, even though, as you know, our legacy at the beginning of Islam was one of the strongest pro-women legacies that came from that far back in history. As I said, we kind of lost momentum around the Abbasid period. So now we're talking about the modern period, roughly 200 years. So when Muslim women made claims to, their own ways of knowing and their agency and their representation, they also followed the legacies of feminism that, sorry, I live in Indonesia and the mosquitoes are my friend. No, they're not. So the journey for Muslim and feminism also piggybacked on the journey for feminisms in other places in the world. And yet, the architects of the first feminisms, they centered their own location. And so there was a period of time where feminism was very white, very middle class, very Western, and in some cases also very secular to the point of being anti-religious. So when I became Muslim in the 1970s, at the same time that women's studies and gender studies was picking up in certain university contexts, I didn't feel that this movement was speaking to me as a Black woman. And then as I become Muslim, I definitely did not feel myself aligned with it. And in fact, for the next 20, 30 years, I actually was very critical of feminism for all the reasons that I think it's legitimate to make criticism, and that is that it's imperialistic, it makes certain presumptions about location, that it's not at all universal, and yet it pretends to be speaking universally for all women. And all of a sudden, I wasn't alone. There were other voices that began to critique feminism in Western contexts and even within feminist circles. And in the last decade, we saw the birth and coherence of what is called intersectionality. And the goal of intersectionality, which in my estimation, is never complete, is to understand that when people come to the table of the discourse over gender equality, women's rights, women representation, they don't all come from the same location. And all of those locations need to be taken into consideration if we have as our goal justice, equality, and dignity for women. That intersectionality, as I said, came at about the same time as I had a very interesting experience, which was in 1995 at the Beijing World Conference for Women, where there were more representation for Muslim women than had been in any of the previous conferences, global conferences on women. And when the women said, oh, you know what, we have this opportunity, we're all in the same location in China, why don't we form our own caucus? They spent a lot of time arguing with each other. And the main crux of the argument was from two, what I call dominant voices at that time. One voice was what I now identify as secular Muslim feminism, because there's some people who believe that you cannot have human rights discourses with any notion of religion within it. And there are Muslims who believe that. And so they wanted the agenda, the global agenda of human rights and women to go forward without consideration of religion. And the other dominant voice was what we now understand as political Islam, or the Islamist voice. And the Islamist voice said, there is no system that could be better than Islam, so we don't need human rights from any Western instruments or the United Nations or anything. Now, these two voices agreed on one thing. You cannot have both Islam and feminism. And that brings me back to this thing about epistemology. How were they defining Islam? Whose definition were they using? And how were they defining feminism? And whose definition was given dominance? Because this was 1995, it inspired, at the time I was a representative for a pro-faith and pro-feminist Muslim women's organization called Sisters in Islam. And it inspired us to go back to the drawing board and become a little bit more coherent why it was that we were not in either camp. The secular Muslim feminists always called us Islamists, and the Islamist feminists always called us secular, which is another indication, you know, of why intersectionality is so important. What do you do when you're in that middle space? And what you do when you're in that middle space is you have to start to self-advocate, to self-define. And we did this by using what is now fundamental to the understanding of the development of Islamic feminism. And that is first, I think I would say first, is epistemology. First, we went back to, for example, sacred text to give a critical reading that was inclusive of gender as a category of thought. Yes, gender always operates in society. Yes, gender is the background of any discussion where the two genders might come in. But to use it as a rubric of critical analysis was a new development that started sometime in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And that is where my first book, I think, sort of came to the fore, because I had intuitively, again, I was not only not feminist, but I decried the label feminist. I had intuitively understood that for me to understand the Quran, remember in the story that I told you from the beginning, I came at the Quran from another religious context as a convert. I came at it after that through study. From that study, I developed research and scholarship and contributed to the discourses over understanding the Quran for all times, all places, and all people, which meant that it was also for me, a Black girl born in Maryland. So understanding the Quran from a gendered lens for me was not motivated by feminism. It was motivated by the very nature of my being. And yet I can admit when I look back now, how much it was a part of this half a century of development. So the first part of Islamic feminism was in fact research, scholarship, epistemology, hermeneutics, challenging the intellectual legacies to understand the ways in which gender had operated in that binary which was hegemonic. Unpacking that to determine that the Tawhidic perspective on gender was equally available, but had not been developed to the same extent that we see was necessary in order for women's agency to be reaffirmed in the way in which it was intended if you look at the Quran as sacred text. We were part of the divine design. You know, Menzo Jane, you know, male, female, the two pair, etc. And you can ask me later about the binary because I am working on that as well. But the understanding that we had this agency given to us in our creation by Allah had not been sustained through the history of patriarchy. So after 1995, I think groups like Sisters in Islam networked with other groups in other parts of the Muslim world where Muslim personal status law was in implementation, because the idea behind Muslim personal status law was, again, how do we live Islam, and particularly how do we live Islam with regard to family? So sometimes it's also called family law. And yet, through the colonial legacy, an interesting thing happened. The colonizers decided that it was expedient not to overturn every aspect of the, you call them the local laws and customs, and they relinquished personal status law to the groups on the ground. And I say this because if you think about a place like India, there were Hindus, there were Muslims, and yet Muslim personal status law developed there because of such a sizable population. And because this area of law was left, it then had to be codified into what we call positive law. In other words, to create a system where it could be aligned with the way in which the colonizers were doing the rest of their politics. And in that process, personal status law became very rigid and patriarchy became fixed and permanent. You could not unpack women's location in society if you went through this personal status law without coming away with the notion that women were secondary citizens, women were subject to men, they must obey men, they must provide sex for men whenever men want it, as long as it's not Ramadan and they don't have their menstruation. I mean, you think that this was somehow, that this was handed down by Allah to the Prophet and that the Prophet handed it down to us, instead of understanding that these were constructs that were developed to help us understand how to live Islam, but they were done from the perspective of male experiences. So when these laws became codified at the level of the nation state, it became very difficult to unpack the extent to which this was a reading of Islam. This was not the only reading of Islam. And that was the territory of Islamic feminism, to provide a critical reading into the ways in which we understand gender and gender relationships in society and in the law, to return to the affirmation of the equality and reciprocity between women and men. So once we sort of clarified that, Islam is a construct and feminism is a construct, we also became eligible to participate in our own construction. And I want to say something in a very specific way about what this means, because sometimes it sounds a little bit abstract. And, I'm having such a good time with it. I expect everybody to have a good time too, but maybe not, okay? One of the ways in which this is done, I just want to kind of clarify, is the inclusion of what we call lived reality as part of the methodology in legal reform. Now, looking at the ways in which I tried to give sort of a general overview of the development of Islam, Islamic thought, Islamic law, and then a little bit, with regard to feminism and moving into the modern period. When, let's go from where we are present. From Sisters in Islam, a global network called Musawa was constructed. And the purpose of Musawa is to unpack the ways in which Muslim personal status law is constructed, but also to construct it in such a way that it once again affirms that tawhidic location of gender equality, reciprocity, and human dignity. And one of the methods that was used was to recenter women's lived realities. And it's really simple. In Islamic law, if you're trying to understand new, say, medical technology, before a jurist, a faqih amongst the fuqaha, before a jurist can make a decision relative to the methodologies and ijtihad of their particular madhab or school of law, they need to understand what is this medical procedure. And to do that, they refer to the expert in medicine. In order to understand how to apply Islamic law, especially personal status law, to the highest ideal of Islam, which is justice and human dignity, with regard to women, then women's lives have to be centered in the way in which we communicate what these things mean. That's why the example that I gave earlier on rape is so easy to confirm. Who's experiencing this, and how is that experience shaped relative to different gender locations? So using lived reality as a rubric of understanding, and this is done in a very precise way. So you can ask me later, if you're interested in some of the details. But this was done in such a way that we provided ongoing discourse about reform using the Tawhidic paradigm and establishing the authority of women's own voices and lived realities in order to critically engage gender in all aspects of reform and in all aspects of interpretation. Excuse me. Now, I have 3 minutes. I told you I'm gonna keep my eye on the clock. And so I just want to say something about what I'm currently experiencing as a challenge that still needs to be faced with regard to Islam and gender discourse. And that is that gender identity is not limited to the cis male and female binary that has become encoded even in the work of some Muslim feminists. And instead, we need to understand that gender and sexual identities are on a spectrum. And we need to be comprehensive about the extent to which when we say something with regard to gender, we are perhaps speaking from a kind of strict binary location and not inclusive of the spectrum that really exists. In this regard, I think that the movement of Islamic feminism still needs to have a comprehensive encounter with notions of queer Islam and how they impact on lived realities of people whose representation does not fit into the strict binaries. And that's the kind of work that I have been also trying to participate in. And that's a whole nother conversation, which I don't have the minutes to get into.
But by the way, you can go still, we still have until 8 o'clock. So you can go maybe 10 minutes.
Okay, all right, I will take that 10 minutes since it is there. Okay, let me say a little bit about how this developed because I've also given some hints. About 2 years ago, I became really interested in the divine feminine, Jamal. And I used it as a part of a conversation of, again, unity and reciprocity alongside the divine or sacred masculine, the Jalal. But historically, what you see is the greater amount of attention has been given to the divine masculine. And as such, it has eclipsed what I call the Tawhidic balance with the feminine. So I began to work on sort of reclaiming the divine feminine. And I have different things that I do on social media, with regard to it. But it allowed me to sort of unpack the reality of even how the Quran uses, for example, the terms zakar wa untha. We take the word zakar to mean male, and we take the word untha to mean female, but actually it's an articulation of masculine and feminine, and masculine and feminine is not exclusive to any one body. Every body, and I mean in the physical sense, every body must have masculine attributes in order to get things done, because masculine is a metaphysical expression of activity. Feminine is a metaphysical expression of receptivity. We must also be receptive because Allah is the power of the universe that we all wish to receive in order to fulfill our agency or khilafah on the earth. So there has always been an intimate relationship between masculine and feminine within our single bodies. And it is a mirror of the reality of the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine of Allah. Allah has feminine attributes, Allah has masculine attributes, and yet Allah transcends gender. Allah is not male, Allah is not female. So when I began working on my research with regard to sexual diversity, I aligned it with what I call human dignity, because that is the unconditional terms of human creation in the Quran. لَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. So karama is an indivisible feature of what it means to be human. Every human deserves dignity, which is why institutions like slavery definitely cannot say to be confirmed by the Quran's participation even in the discourses about existing institutions of slavery. And at the same time, recognizing how complex is the human being, the idea of restricting us to not include the inherent dynamism within our own single bodies is best used as an instrument to help us understand the struggles today for queer Muslim identities to be affirmed, again, using their lived realities and self-representation, to be affirmed as part of the aspect of the natural aspects of diversity. Humans are diverse. Two twins, identical twins, they're still not exactly the same, right? So humans are diverse, and part of our diversity is the ways in which we inculcate the masculine and the feminine in our own natures. I mean, I thought this was really interesting for me because I realized that intellectually, I am very, very masculine. I'm very, very assertive about understanding things and about bringing that understanding to others. Very, very masculine, you know, but I'm very kind of feminine identified as far as my personality. And I used to get into and I couldn't understand why they would get so aggressive. And I realized that I am, in fact, very aggressive with my ideas, with my thoughts, with the developments in my research. I'm very assertive. And so I had to also reconcile masculine and feminine within my own being in order to achieve what I call sort of the Tawhidic mental or psychological states that are instrumental in building my best spiritual state so I can be the best agent before Allah. So some of the understanding of what we need to move forward in terms of Islam and feminism is that we do not have a monolith understanding of what it means to be female. And I feel that the women's organizations and groups who have worked on gender issues over the past several decades feel that they have a lot at stake in maintaining the headway that they have created by then becoming themselves participants in a system that is a little bit biased towards the heteronormative binary. So I am presenting that as a challenge to Islamic feminism in the way forward. But at the same time, what I mostly wanted to share with you was a glimpse at how Islamic feminism was a dynamic development that benefited from reform movements in Islam, but also benefited from internal critiques that were given within the discourses and epistemology of feminism. So with that, I think I will say, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Amina Wadud, for this very inspiring talk. We really appreciate it. And so I don't want to take more time because I have, the audience, mashallah, and we have many people here. I'd like to thank them all for coming here, my students, some of my faculty members, and some of the staff. Thank you very much indeed for coming. And I would like now to open it up for discussion, and if anybody has any question, please show a show of hands. You go to the restriction and then raise your hand so that I see priorities who is going to speak first. And then unmute yourself, please, after that. So any questions, any comments? Now, my students in my class, the Quran Texts and Women, many of them are here today. We begin the class usually. This is a class that I have been teaching since 2007. And I begin with your book, Quran and Woman, rereading the sacred from a woman's perspective. Then after you, they read Ni'amat Barzanji. Quran and Woman, a new reading. And then we're doing now Ingrid Masson and her interviews, and then we go to Asma Barlas and so on. So after they finish Barzanji, there is a session a whole week of comparing you and Barzanji. So
Mm.
it's a very interesting session. So I have some of them who are here today. If they have anything that they would like to share or any questions that they have or anybody else, there are students from other classes as well, and then some of my colleagues as well. So please go ahead if you have any question or a comment. Now somebody is posing a question on text. Okay, go ahead, Ali.
Hi, assalamu alaikum.
Alayhi salam.
I was really inspired by your speech today. I had a question about something
Ali,
you said.
Ali, can you introduce yourself, please? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ali. I am a student of yours.
Yes.
I took this class because I really wanted to know more about Islam and how it affected women, because I grew up in a very conservative household where I really want to see more out of my religion for my family and for my siblings and my mother, my sister. So I want to expand on that.
Okay.
I want to ask a question regarding how it took you 13 years to fully accept the term feminism. And I want to know more if it was just because of the secular and Islamist state of voices, or if there was other aspects that you didn't really, relate to at the time.
Okay, I'm just going to make a small correction. I have only been feminist for 13 years. It took me therefore, I would say that leaves 46 years.
Sorry about that.
No worries. I just think it's kind of funny. And in that time, as I mentioned, I was privy to some of the discourses in the US as a Black woman from a very poor family. And the discourses, in those days was not universal. It was not inclusive. It was not intersectional. There were challenges that were being presented, especially by Black women. And it took some time before those challenges were integrated. And so I did not feel that feminism represented me. And as I immersed myself in my Islamic experiences, living in Muslim cultures across Asia and Africa, the dominant discourse about feminism was really far-fetched for what we were experiencing. And then the dominant discourses about feminism became itself a tool for the interrogation and humiliation of Islam and Muslims. Like Laura Bush saying, we're going to free those Afghan women from Islam, and look what the result is, even in the past recent years with the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. So the idea that just because you say feminist, that feminism is intersectional was not a part of my early introduction to feminism. And as such, therefore, it made it not only irrelevant, but sometimes problematic. There was in my entire dedication to issues of social justice and human dignity, there's always been an emphasis on spirituality. I like to tell people, because my father, who was a Methodist minister, took me to the March on Washington with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when I was just before my 11th birthday. I was 10 years and 10 months, that there has never been a separation of my notion of God from my notions of social justice. So a faith-based dedication to social justice was not a part of the discourses of mainstream feminism for most of those years. And even when they began to do integration of it through, sort of feminist scholarship in areas of, say, the other dominant religions in the West, Judaism and Christianity, and then in terms of like Buddhism and Hinduism, and other world religions, they still continue to say that Islam is irredeemably patriarchal, cannot be confirmed in any way through feminism, and that you cannot have Islamic feminism. So that was a long-standing location for me that I experienced in my scholarship, in my publications, in my presentations at professional groups. And that division left me in a position where I just said, well, there's nothing in feminism for me. And that stayed until the launching of Souad, literally in 2009, when I came to a better understanding that that kind of feminism is not the kind of feminist that I am. And at the same time, as I said, that kind of Islam, patriarchal hegemonic Islam, is not my Islam. And how those two things came together is part of the construction of Islamic feminism. And that's when I could go wholly into that title. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Reem Asad. Before I say her question, it's on chat. Dr. Wadud, what you're saying now reminded me of Barbara Christian's statement when she said, she has an article called The Race for Theory, and she was critical, of Western feminism and argued that in their race for theory, women forgot that women come from different backgrounds, they have different histories, and so she's just negating the idea that there is only one monolithic definition of feminism. And that's exactly what you're saying now. So Reem Saeed, thank you, Reem. Thank you, Ali, for your question. She said, what was one thing you learned when studying and researching throughout your life that really changed how you thought about life and about Islam?
One thing. Wow. I don't know. I'm a Libra. I don't like to make decisions. Let me just try to think on that. I actually think it's Tawheed. Let me just give you a little bit of background. When you become Muslim, you have the option to change your name to something usually Arabic, no motivation why that's necessary, but that's what we thought. And my first husband and I, when we first changed our name, the name that we chose as our last name was At-Tawhidi, one who believes in Tawheed. And at the time, for both of us as former Christians, we were very interested in the theological part of that, because Christianity also identifies as monotheistic, but it still has the tripartite understanding. And so we were really trying to confirm, the oneness of the Creator. So I have a long history with this term, but what really happened was about the time I was introduced to the Mandelbrot set. Don't know if you know anything about this. It's a mathematical formula that has sometimes, when you plot it out, it's been called the eye of God, because it shows how there is an internal unity. Even if you divide this into its smallest element, it replicates itself. And when you spread it out, it continues to replicate itself. And if you spread it out far enough, it's the entire universe. And about the time I got introduced to the Mandelbrot set was about the same time that I was exploring literature written about Islam and social justice that had used the Tawhidic paradigm as a way to, express it, especially thinking about a short introduction to sociology of Islam by Ali Shariati. He has this whole thing on Tawheed. And every place where I was looking into this, I would say like coalition of understanding Islam through Tawheed, it was exclusive of gender. And as I'm living this reality, so I'm not buying it, but I don't have yet a way to articulate it. And Sach Kumarata, her book on the Tao of Islam, helped break it down for me, because she outlines the Sufi discourses about the relationship between the two gender. And as she outlines it, she continues to participate in the hegemony of it. And I kept saying that just can't be right. And it was actually, a kind of like, a gift that I was fiddling around with these little desk toys, how they have like little things on your desk, especially you see, I always use my hands, right? And these were little magnetic balls with little pegs that attached to them in various colors. And I kept looking at her model, Allah, male, female, and thinking, no, there's something wrong with this. And in fact, I teach this now when I teach workshops on gender equality. Islam believes there's no intermediary between any person and Allah, the creator. In that model, Allah, male, female, the female has no direct access to Allah. So that's when I thought we need another model. And I played around with these, these sort of desktop toys. And I came up with that triangle. And that's when I realized, oh, Allah is the highest focal point. Everybody is in agreement with that. But what happens if you remove the hegemony of the vertical model and instead emphasize the horizontal model with male and female at the two ends of it, what it created was a rubric of understanding that was unconditionally reciprocal equality. We are a mirror of each other because we believe in the one Allah. And so that's when I began to really conscribe the Tawhidic paradigm as a social justice rubric, which then could be implemented into law, because wherever equality and reciprocity was not confirmed, it was in fact a construct of that hegemony. That hegemony had been excuse me, completely encoded, as I said, in the law and emphasized a lot by culture. It was also my main motivation in accepting the role of being the Lady Imam, because once I removed the notion that somehow Allah wanted me to be only in deference to the male, and I returned to a place where I had direct agency with Allah for the fulfillment of my khilafah or agency on the earth. Once this materialized at the very deepest level of my soul, the rest of my life was done. So far, at least, it's still been confirmed that somehow I am participating in the unity and beauty and the harmony of the whole creation, but also being an active participant in the confirmation of equality and human dignity for all persons as an aspect of Islam fundamentally. So I would say that the Tawhidi paradigm is the one thing that really, really made the difference.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm so happy that your speech generated so many questions. I have so many questions on chat. I will give the floor to my colleague Dr. Mirna Latouf. Then we have Carolina, and we have Ella, and we have Nicole, and everybody else. I will give them a chance. So, Dr. Mirna.
Okay, thank you so very much. So I teach on women, feminism, gender identity. I teach religious studies as well. And I'm interested in your perspective on, in the 21st century, more and more research, and the latest by Pew Research Center and others on religion, argue that more and more young people around the world are rejecting organized religions and embracing more spiritual, mystical aspect of the one they were brought in, but they have their own kind of way of defining that, not going to any scripture, or less problematic philosophies, such as, in their view, Buddhism, or are more and more identifying across the world as none, N-O-N-E, in terms of religious identification. One of the things that young people, male or female, have problems is that these traditional patriarchal religions no longer have meaning in today's world. And no matter how feminists, religious feminists, Jewish feminists, or Christian or Muslim try to bring women into it, it's just not making any sense to them. So can you address that? And have you found resistance to not only your, but other religious feminist approaches? Thank you.
Wow, that's a whole dissertation. Oh man, it's such a good question though. So let me see if I can do some unpacking of it. First of all, I'm just going to be a little bit tongue in cheek and say,
I hope does it make sense what I'm asking?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does make sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
I assume my enthusiasm would indicate how much sense it made to me, but that's okay. Hopefully my answer will. First, I just want to say that the Pew Foundation is not a religious studies expert. So unfortunately, I cannot rely upon how they might define something like religion, let alone how they might decide to indicate that it's organized religion. So let me unpack that for a minute because it's important to the rest of my answer. And that is, if you look at the history of the phenomena of religion amongst humans, it's one of the things that we have evidence has existed amongst humans from the beginning of humans. So anything we have about humans, there's some indication of this relationship with the non-ordinary. So when I'm going to define religion, that's what I'm going to be defining. The input of the word organized is also politically charged because once again, they are codifying someone's particular organizing principles and then saying that is the religion. And this is extremely important for the work of Islamic feminism and for my work as well personally. And that is that the sacred, the creator, does not make the divisions into religion and spirituality that the New Age assertions are making. Because it is possible to have a spiritual experience and be in a quote unquote organized religion. And it is possible to identify as spiritual and to be very rigid in your organization. So I don't believe any of those terms are sufficient in and of themselves. They all need to be unpacked. So let me go to what I consider to be the more important thing. So you said, have I come into any of this with regard to bringing women into, I don't have to bring women into the religion. Before humans were created, Allah intended women to be their own selves, to be in a relationship with Allah. That relationship is what we call Islam, that is in surrender. Nobody has to bring us in, we're already there. However, no religion, organized or mystical, can be put into practice except through people. And if human civilization, about which we have also a great deal of evidence, if human civilization has all been patriarchal, with few little spots here and there where it didn't happen, and they've been that way for like 6,000 years, unpacking patriarchy from the religion. Patriarchy is not fundamental to religion. Patriarchy is fundamental to humans, and we need to unpack it, but we can't do religion unless we do it as humans. And so as a consequence, we have confirmed patriarchy, even in the ways in which we have interpreted and implemented or practiced religions. Unpacking that, that's why I say it needs a dissertation, unpacking that has been my life's work, 50 years, because I do not relinquish my Islam to anyone for any reason. I do not need anyone's permission to define Islam in accordance to my own research and soul search, both of which I have done throughout that 50 years. So the idea that you relinquish religions because you call it organized, as if, and there's a kind of arrogance in this, and I believe this arrogance is intentional, as if somehow all the mystical experiences of the human populations across time have only been extra religious, that is outside of religion, that is historically inaccurate. So if people in the modern period want to assert for themselves that they are not a part of organized religion, what I hear, because of course I do a lot of public work, what I hear when that comes up is I don't want to be a part of a rigid definition of who I am within that religion and even how I participate in it. Well, since I've been doing that my whole life, I never get any people confronting me with regard to that. I identify, for the sake of politics, as an eclectic Muslim. I have to do that because I'm not only am I the daughter of a Methodist minister who bequeathed me the God of love. My last name Wadud comes from El-Wadud, the attribute of Allah that means loving. Not only was I bequeathed the loving God from my father, meaning I had no problem with Christianity in my experience of it as I was growing up, but also while I was in the university, I became a Buddhist and I started practicing meditation, which I still do daily now. And then, once a year I go for a 10-day silent meditation retreat. So I'm an eclectic Muslim, and I accept the identification not only with my own religious experiences as a Muslim, but also with the religious experiences of my ancestors. So, and then I have bequeathed that legacy to my children, 4 of whom identify as Muslim, but 3 of whom have gone on to form spiritual and social justice communities in the public space. And then they intermarried with multiple religions, multiple religions and ethnicities. So I have all these hybrid grandchildren. So I don't have an organized patriarchal notion of Islam, period. Like, I just don't have it. I recognize that other people do have it, and I try to work with what is the source of their understanding and what is the context of their experiences, but I don't relinquish Islam to just that articulation. And if the quote unquote New Agers with their I'm spiritual and not religious, not organized religious, if they hope to have any any headway with regard to those articulations, they might need to train themselves a little bit more. And actually the history of the phenomena of religion in all of its complexity. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed. Now we have 4 questions, and for the sake of time, I'm going to read 2 of them, Carolina and Ella, and then Nicole and Cassandra. So Carolina said to you, do you particularly view the dress code as a form of oppression or a religious requirement in your culture that you are happy to participate in? And Ella's question is, has your research ever felt at odds with your spirituality? If so, how did you resolve that conflict? And then after these questions, the 2, we're going to come to Nicole and Sandra. Thank you.
Okay, wow, lovely questions. I am hijabi by choice. I mentioned a little bit about my conversion experience on Thanksgiving Day, that I'd already started dressing modestly and covering my hair as a part of my identity as a Black woman in America, because there is there's a double standard with regard to how Black women are conceived of in the public space. I do not cover all the time. I always cover with regard to public events as a matter of politics. Politics is, if you look at what's that title of the book, Politics of the Veil? If you look at that book, you will understand that even no matter what my personal decisions may be, I enter into an arena of a politicized discourse where it's either going to be enforced that you wear it or enforced that you take it off by certain governments and certain cultures. And I defy both of those as being the point of identity for me. So I take mine off when I want to, and I keep mine on when I want to, and nobody gets to determine which one of those I will do. But I do it in a very personal identification with the legacy of the dignity of my own people, Black women, who were brought here from Africa, enslaved, and then stripped of their garments and not allowed to choose how they would be presented in the public space. And I use something that stylistically is related to Islam, because stylistically I find those to be the most attractive. That's just the way that, if you look at the other book, Modest, what's the book, Liz Bukhar's book on there's a title about modesty and piety and the dress. It's a wonderful book. She examines choices, especially young women have been making across Turkey, Indonesia, and a couple other places in the world. Pious fashion. So there is obviously, you know, like a fashion predilection that goes with it. I am a part of an active discourse to remove the enforcement of either taking it off or putting it on everywhere. I do participate in those conversations, but mine is very personal. It's not cultural. I'm African-American. And after 9/11, every time I would go through any airport security in America, wouldn't happen in other places in the world, maybe a little bit in Europe, I would be put with all the brown people and the immigrants and stuff like that because I was noticeably Muslim, whereas all the Black people that you recognize as Black people, that I recognize as Black people because I'm Black, they were all let go through. And I thought, oh, well, that's really interesting because now there's a whole nother politic that's going on here. And so I elected to always have my hijab on when I went through security, whereas, as I said, I don't wear it all the time. So it is a question of choice for me, and I exercise that choice out of a privileged position that I am an international traveler, and I'm afforded the opportunity to make the choices that I make without having it be denied, but it's not my culture. As far as something at odds with my research and my spirituality, I did mention that, you know, I did this research funded by the Arcus Foundation for 3 years on sexual diversity and human dignity. And I did come to some challenges. And the beauty of this is when you are honest with yourself with regard to the challenge, and you do, you know, what they call in the Black spiritual, you know, wading in the water. To wade in the water, you must enter fully, you must immerse yourself. Immersing myself in that which was causing doubt allowed me, and to do so honestly, allowed me to honestly either resolve or to defy. And so, yes, I do experience conflicts or things at odds between my research and spirituality. But again, because I'm working on the integration of my masculine and feminine, my Jamal and my Jalal, my yin and my yang, these two things work in concert to actually bring me greater serenity spiritually and as far as the rational or intellectual research goes. So they work in tandem to enhance the experience of, you know, of being alive.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, Nicole's question says, it's an honor to hear from you. Thank you, Dr. Wadud. As Dr. Ali has mentioned, we have read your book, Quran and Women, Rereading the Sacred from a Woman's Perspective, 1999. Is there anything you would want to update us as a new addition to the book?
You're going to read the second question, or?
Yeah, I would read the second question from Cassandra. She said, were these feminist views sparked by other cultures or religions? Is the term feminism a sort of awakening for women to understand the Quran, the Quranic words, and through different perspectives and not just what is taught to them?
Okay, so Quran and Woman was first published in 1992. I just want to confirm that that's why I said 30 years. The edition that you have with the white cover was when the copyrights were transferred to the Oxford University Press office in New York. It's not the original publication date, although the text is exactly the same with the addition of a glossary and a new preface to the new edition. So 1999 is not. However, in 1999, I did begin working on my second book, and that book is called Inside the Gender Jihad. And in it, chapter 6 is literally the sequel to Quran and Woman. It's very complicated in terms of dealing with certain aspect of methodology, but I would urge you to look at that if you want to know how my own thoughts have developed, specifically with regard to Quran interpretation. And subsequently, I did a number of publications with the Musawa movement. So Musawa.org, Musawa spelled with an H at the end, is online, and they have resources. So you can get copies of subsequent work that I've done with regard to different levels of interpretation. So interpretation as a method of reading the Quran for me, alhamdulillah, does continue to grow. And most recently, I was just talking to a guest that I had in my home. Most recently, the research that I did on gender diversity and human dignity has led to yet another, and I have not written about it anywhere. I've done it in some classes and stuff like that. And it is about ambiguity as spiritual methodology. So I'm looking forward to taking the time to develop that, for the purpose of print. So yes, I most definitely moved from 1992, literally based on research that I did between 1985 and getting my PhD in 1988. So that work is way older, and alhamdulillah, I have continued to grow, and I have continued to provide a discussion about that growth, some of which I've mentioned to you here, and some of which is still ongoing. As far as, let's get feminist views at SPART. Okay, so I try to explain that my particular sojourn in feminism was comprehensively and exclusively a part of my journey through Islam and gender and sexuality discourse. Of course, I've had many wonderful opportunities by organized meetings, conference panels, individual lectures and programs, retreats with women of many religions in the world. I mean, I live in Asia. I mean, I just taught a course in hermeneutics with a professor from a Catholic university, and he explored in his PhD the relationship between Asian culture and the understanding of Christianity, and also referred to other feminist Asian scholars of Christianity. And of course, I've known and worked with quite a few of them in a number of, as I said, platforms over the years. So of course, there has been a cross-fertilization of ideas. But at this point, the main motivation for me has been rather exclusively of my own faith journey through Islam. I have shared quite a bit of that with you, like, for example, the Tawhidi paradigm, and how that transformed not only my scholarship, my activism and spirituality. And because there are, I guess you could say, enough challenges to being, a Black female from a poor background, who is a scholar and activist in Islam, because there are enough challenges just within that one, corner of the planet. I have not yet had the opportunity, I can say, to benefit from the ways in which the feminist struggles have unfolded themselves for women in other religious traditions. With the exception of something that happened sometime during the pandemic. I was invited to give a lecture for Guru Jagat. She passed away within the last 6 months. She was only 41 years old. And I had never been so impressed with a person who didn't know me, and didn't know my work, by the way in which she interviewed me. You can see it on my YouTube channel, or you can join my Patreon page to do it. And one of the things that I can say that she inspired in me, and I've dedicated this year to it, is about locating yourself in the joy of your spiritual path. To find the joy, to live in the joy. Joy is one of those things you can't fake. Like it has to be comprehensive. Now, I have loved Islam. I've been challenged by Islam. But I made a decision that in my 70th year of life, half a century as an adult Muslim, and 30 years since my first publication, and I want to say add 10 years, since Hajj and Umrah, that in this stellar year that I would take this year to be a year of the affirmation of joy. And I think I can honestly say that I learned that from Guru Jagat, and so I do feel that there's a book called Never Wholly Other by Harusha Lamti from UTS, Union Theological Seminary in New York. And she actually talks about the methodology of shared religious readings by women. I just think it's a really good point. And I guess if I were to say I was inspired by any religious discourses around gender and feminism, it was not by Christian or Jewish women. It was either by Muslims or by women who are part of Wiccan or by Buddhist, locations and some animist, locations. That if I was inspired, I would be inspired by women from traditions that are not theologically monotheistic, but actually they're a little bit more pantheistic. If I were to be inspired, I think that would be where it would come. But so far, we're having a nice exchange. It hasn't yet been that they bring the inspiration, except for this aspect of joy and Guru Jagat. May she rest in peace. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Professor Amina Wadud. With that, we come to the close of this very beautiful 90 minutes with you and your inspirational talk and questions from the audience, my colleagues and my students. I really appreciate all of the participation, and we really appreciate your time, and we are very sorry that we woke you up so early in Indonesia, and so it's night here, it's morning, early morning on Friday, and so somebody is just asking another last question. Let me see who's that, and that would be the last one here. I just wanted to say this has been one of the most engaging and easy to understand lectures while unpacking heavy topics I have listened to in a long time. So thank you for coming, and thank you very much indeed. And many Maya and other people are just, it's difficult to, so Cassandra, Nicole, and let me see, all of them, they're thanking you all over again. And see who.
Thank you all, and thank you, Professor Souad. I love your questions. I especially love when questions come outside of the box, because sometimes you get the same things over and over again. And just FYI, I wake up at 4 to 4:30 every day, do my prayer and meditation. So by the time we got to my lecture, I had already done, quite a few things. So this is a great time for me. No problem whatsoever. Thank you, Souad.
Thank you very much. And Cole Richmond, that comment was from Cole Richmond. Thank you very much indeed once again. And thank you, everybody. We really appreciate all of your time, Dr. Amina Wadud. And we hope to see you again in person, maybe next time on campus. I know that the time you were here, it was 2007, when you were invited by the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. And then I invited you in 2013 as part of the American Academy for Religion Western Region. You were our keynote speaker. And now we are very happy to see you the third time, and we look forward to seeing you again. So have a good day, and thank you.
Thank you so much.
And on behalf on behalf of the advisory board of the Council for Arabic and Islamic Studies, I'd like to thank everybody. I'd like to remind you of our next event, which is a part of the Arabic film and poetry series on April 20th. And it's going to focus on contemporary and modern Arabic poetry. And we will please keep, following our website, and stay tuned for upcoming events as well. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Sparsh, my graduate aide, for all of the IT work. And thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you soon, inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome.
Thank you.